I've actually redone my introductory psychology lectures pretty much completely over the last 2 or 3 times I've taught the class, based on some advice that Bob Cialdini, who's a classic, one of the better known persuasion researchers, he pushed this idea that there's one thing that really engages people more than anything else in a lecture. And it's not a long list of things. It's not giving an outline that lays out where you're going and what you're going to do next. It's establishing some sort of a mystery, something that you want the answer to. And if you can actually pull that off, where you actually don't have a laid out organizational structure, but you have a big question, and then each step along the way you're providing evidence in that question, it can be a tremendously powerful, influential tool for presenting. So I actually, in my classes, no longer give an outline of what I'm going to discuss. I no longer give a summary slide of what I've said in that class period. They can have my slides after the fact, but I don't give them out in advance because I want them to be interested in what the evidence shows and to think about how you could actually answer a sort of interesting question. Well, there are practical things you can do to keep people engaged. One is not to have too much stuff on your slides. So I have a pretty hard and fast rule for my slides, which is no more than 6 lines of text on a slide and no more than 6 words on a line. And if you feel like you have to shrink the text down or add more lines to get all your content across, you have too much content on the slide. So it's really hard to focus on slides and focus on the person who's speaking and explaining, and if they're spending every moment writing down what's on the slides, then they're not going to be paying attention to you. And I found over the years that students are not necessarily good note takers. They don't know which things to write down, which things not to write down, and the tendency is to write down everything that's on the slides, even though the slides might be available later anyway, so there's no reason to write down everything that's on the slides. If they're going to do that, I can make it easier for them by not writing that much on the slides and having them focus on me, and then I've got a fighting chance of having them listening to the arguments and listening to what I'm saying. So that's one big thing. I like to use examples, images, things that they can understand in a very simple way. I use a lot of short video clips, not long ones. Nothing longer than a couple of minutes at most. In an hour-and-a-half long class I might use. The longest video I might show would be 3 minutes. But you know, if you show a quick video clip from a television show that's really familiar, that really illustrates a point, or you show, every now and then just something that's got humor value, it can really make a compelling difference. It can kind of wake them up, especially if it's relevant humor. The biggest thing for me, I think, when I jumped into teaching, was I was so afraid that somebody in this class would know more than I did, and would challenge me, and I wouldn't be able to respond, and I wouldn't have an answer. And it's kind of a variant of the imposter syndrome. We all think we're faking it. And in teaching, we're often teaching things we don't know, so we are, in some sense, pretending to be experts on things that we can't be experts in everything. There are a couple things that I think can really help counter that. One is to realize that you do actually know quite a bit more than the students you're teaching. And you do have a lot more experience thinking about the sorts of things and the way you think about psychology than undergraduates will. Even as a first-year graduate student, you have more experience thinking about research than an undergraduate does. So you can learn the details more quickly than an undergraduate can. The other thing that I think really helps counter that is to not be afraid to not know. It's perfectly fine to say, that's a really good question. I have no idea, but let me look it up, and I'll come back to you next class with the answer. And then do come back the next class with the answer. Students respect that you don't know everything, and you're willing to admit when you don't know it, and they know when you're faking it. So if you really don't know something, but you think it actually is a good question, look it up. And don't be afraid to say so. If you've got the kid who's going to challenge everything you say, ask them, and have them make the connections, and sometimes they'll be able to, and that's great. Then you get extra insight, and sometimes they can't, and you can help them connect it. So, not being intimidated and worried if a student is going to ask tough questions. You want them to ask tough questions. And in fact, in my very first class, I tell them that they should not trust everything I say, because the odds are good that things that are published in psychology, at some point, some of them might be disproven. If they think something's wrong, that's fine to think something's wrong. What evidence would you need to prove me wrong? And I encourage them to question. and don't get offended if they ask something that seems skeptical of what I'm saying. I do my best to answer the way I think it should be, and if I don't have a good answer, I try and come back with more information. But I think students tend to respect that more than you might think when you view yourself as somebody imparting information. It's much better to have them discovering the information. When you think about designing your own classes, think back about the moments in each class that you remember the most. That's what I did when I started teaching, is think back about what classes did I like the most? Which professors did I like the most? Why did I like them? What did they do? And what I discovered, at least for me, was the things that really stuck were really compelling examples and demos. That if you can give something that people experience an effect, and then you can kind of lay all of the foundations around that, I remembered it so much better. And doing that well is hard, but if you can give people something that they experience, even if it's hokey, even if it's silly, something that they can remember having done, and use that as a retrieval cue for all of the other sorts of things that they need to remember about it, it can be tremendously powerful. So that was the sort of technique that my favorite teachers as an undergraduate did, and I try and emulate that, and I'll never do it as well as they did, but it's a technique that can work really well.